Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green and you're watching Greenwave TV, alternative media television. It is Monday, November 28th, 2011, and we have a market rallying today, almost 300 points. The Dow Jones Industrial Average here in the United States of America, rallying on hope. Hope that European leaders and leaders in the United States can actually contain this global debt implosion, that they can contain this crisis, that they can prevent HIV spreading and turning into AIDS, and ultimately collapsing the 17 euro member state and collapsing the euro currency in the process. But you see, all this is hope. None of this will be accomplished, and it's important that we understand what global leadership, what Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and President Nicolas Sarkozy of France are trying to accomplish with this latest infinity round of bailout measures aimed to bail out Greece, aimed to bail out Portugal, Spain, Ireland. Now we're seeing this with Italy, its 10-year bond market rising above the key level of 7%, which triggers an itchy trigger finger among private investors to sell that debt, because that is the level that Greece hit and Portugal and Ireland hit before needing an international bailout through these bailout mechanisms. Now, in the meantime, they've created these new bailout institutions such as the EFSF, which has been levered $1 trillion plus in euro dollars to bail out these countries. Yet systemically, we see country by country, and we've seen this work its way starting with Greece, work its way all the way to the German bond market, which had a failed issuance last week, selling only 60% of its sovereign debt. So we can see the trickle effect move from the most insolvent nations in the PIGS region and finally move and work its way into full-blown AIDS with France and Germany. But here's the point. This is what the average person needs to understand. It's what we need to understand. It's what you need to understand watching. These bailout measures and these bailout mechanisms and these fanciful ideas are based on hope. It's based on fantasy. Because at the end of the day, what our European counterparts and what our counterparts here in the United States are trying to accomplish is simply to control the demolition of Europe, control the demolition of the euro. We are now reading that Britain, via its embassies overseas in the Eurozone, is warning its expats to exit the region in an orderly fashion prior to the inevitable bankruptcy and collapse of the PIGS nation in the 17-member Eurozone state, which will ultimately result, as it's warning itself, Britain is warning its expats, in absolute chaos and in riots. So we need to understand what's coming, what's inevitably coming, because again, this is controlling the demolition, this is controlling the inevitability, what is going to be a complete and utter disintegration of the Eurozone as private investors continue to force the hand of the private debt markets. And it's important that we watch the debt markets. It's important we watch the bond market, which is much larger than the stock market. And if we look at indicators such as yields on, average 10-year bonds in the Eurozone region, eclipsing that 7% range, that critical range, if we take a look at interbank lending and we take a look at Treasury debt here in the United States of America, these are all huge warning signs of what's coming and provides us an indicator that the stock market will later reflect in its pricing. Instead of a manic, oversold, panic buying from your short position Monday, Cyber Monday, which is what we've gotten historically over the past several weeks. But what we have is a disorderly collapse, which is exactly what these leaders are trying to avoid. It's exactly what they're trying to prevent. Because we need to understand what happens when the euro does finally collapse and when a country such as Greece finally exits, which is an inevitability. And when they do that, when they exit from the Eurozone and they exit from the euro itself, all of a sudden, those people living in Greece that are paying a mortgage in euros are now suddenly paying that mortgage that needs to be paid in euros in drachmas. And because the drachmas have been repriced based on the private markets, that person with drachmas now that used to be holding euros can't afford to make his payment in euros to the banks that are holding the debt in euros. And it doesn't matter whether or not this, starts with Greece or starts with Italy or starts with Ireland or Portugal or Spain. The first country to exit out of the region marks the disintegration of this entire experiment that has lasted just a little over a decade. Hasn't really lasted that long at all, due to the fact that this Eurozone region in the, great boom years of the past decade have been borrowing excessive amounts of debt and basically creating and helping to propagate a Ponzi scheme that would ultimately create the greatest wealth transfer in history and ultimately steal from the people, which is exactly why, as a consequence, we've had movements grow across the planet, whether or not this be the Occupy Wall Street movement or just organic movements in general, that are causing people to physically die, to be killed in the streets, as we've seen over 50 people killed over in Egypt recently. So we need to understand fundamentally that the intention of global leadership isn't to save the economy. It isn't to save the Eurozone. It isn't to save the euro. It isn't to save the US dollar. None of this can be saved. None of this can be salvaged. It can only be controlled. It can only be a controlled demolition, so it can buy them a little bit more time to try to prevent a disorderly collapse and instead organize and help to facilitate an orderly collapse. But the problem with that is we will not have an orderly collapse. There is no such thing. Just listen to the terms. How is it possible that you can have an orderly collapse? It isn't possible. So what they've been doing is getting their ducks in a row. They've been helping to facilitate this very large wealth transfer. They've been spending a lot of time and energy selling you, the public, on bailing out these financial institutions so the uber elite and this uber wealthy, this top 0.001%, can take all of the assets, take all of the resources before the inevitable disorderly collapse, which will ultimately, as Britain is warning right now to its expats overseas, result in not only austerity, but complete breakdown of civilization, complete breakdown in civility, where people ultimately take to the streets. And if you think Cyber Monday is bad, if you think that Black Friday is bad, when we read about people pepper spraying people, over an Xbox game, and we read about a gentleman that died in a local Target and people just stomped over him and didn't even try to help the guy who was in cardiac arrest. Just imagine what's going to happen when people lose everything. Just imagine what's going to happen in Greece or Spain or Italy or here in the United States when our common currency collapses, when the euro collapses, when the dollar collapses, and you're suddenly on the streets, when you're suddenly in foreclosure, as millions of Americans are, when you're suddenly out of a job, when you suddenly come to the realization that you are literally going hungry. Hungry, physically. You're physically ill due to the fact of these malicious, fraudulent, corrupt practices at the very top that have created the biggest bubble in the history of man, the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of man. Also, it can collapse in a little over a decade and erode not just morality, but erode an entire way of life and an entire system. So it's important that we understand what's coming down the pike so that we can prepare. There's those of you preparing with food, gold, guns, ammo, silver. There are those of you that are preparing intellectually for what's coming, emotionally. There are those of you that are preparing spiritually. These are all the bases that we need to cover before we can inevitably educate the masses to what's coming and ultimately rebuild a new system and completely eradicate the old. Completely eradicate this uber wealthy, this uber elite, this leadership that is corrupt. Not that there's anything wrong with wealth, not that there's anything wrong with leadership necessarily, but there is something wrong with corruption. There is something wrong with a malicious campaign that is working directly against the people to steal from them, to rob from them, to destroy their way of life, to destroy their well-being. That is not liberty and freedom. We're fighting all these wars overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, and there's talks now of an invasion, of a coming invasion of Iran, Syria. We've got drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen, and we're fighting all these wars on terror. We're fighting all these wars on drugs. We're fighting the war on poverty. We're fighting all these wars. But have you noticed, since we've been fighting all of these wars over the past several decades, we haven't won anything? And if our troops are supposedly fighting for freedom, for the preservation of our liberty and freedom, then why is it we don't have it? Why is it that they're passing backdoor legislation right now as we speak to curtail the freedom of speech, to curtail the freedom of press, to censor the internet and channels like you're watching. Why is this the case? And the reason for this is the plan. This is a part of the controlled demolition. This is a part of the collapse. This is exactly why they're buying more time. To build the infrastructure needed to contain the riots, to contain the civil disorder, to contain what I've called for some time the anarchy state that's coming to Europe, that's coming to the United States, and that we've already seen the first waves of this through the protests such as Occupy Wall Street and the revolutions, the multiple revolutions, overseas in places like Egypt. This is what's coming, but the difference is the next wave is going to be a tsunami. It's going to make the wave of 2008, the wave of 09, 10, and 11 look like child's play compared to what's coming. I'm Christopher Green. You've been watching Green Wave TV, alternative media television, and I just delivered the Daily Wave. Hard-hitting and in your face, America.